Life is hard, and emotions like anger, guilt, greed, and envy steal your joy and undermine your faith. Join us as we dig beneath the surface and learn to say no to toxic emotions.
Well, hi everyone. Money is on everyone's mind right now. The economy, grocery prices, gas prices, cryptocurrency, net worth. There's TV ads asking, are you doing better financially than you were, fill in the blank years ago? And it's easy to see this as a political issue or an economic issue or an inflation issue. But here's the deal. Finances are not just an out there thing. They're an in here thing. It's a heart issue. Ultimately, your money issues and my money issues are not money issues at all. What drives financial decisions is not our money, it's our heart. Every purchase is a heart decision. So this month in our series, Beneath the Surface, we're asking the question, how is it with your heart? We're learning how to say no to 4 toxic emotions: guilt, anger, greed, and envy. And today, we're going to talk about counteracting greed. The past 2 weeks, we've talked about guilt and anger, and so far, so good. They're kind of no-brainers. We all struggle with guilt and anger at some level, but when it comes to greed, some of you have an instant reaction that says, cool, I know some people around here who need a good talking to about greed, or I hope all the rich people are listening today, or maybe even I hope my kids are listening. They keep begging me for the next latest, greatest toy or technology. And it's tricky because greed is easy to see in your kids, and it's easy to see in corrupt corporations, and it's easy to see in people we think are richer than we are. But greed is much harder to see in yourself. It's slippery, it's crafty, it's deceptive. And so just to help us personalize it a bit, we're going to take a little true and false quiz. Ready? Just keep track in your head. True or false? I have at least once purchased something unwisely. True or false? I've at least once compared myself with someone else financially. I've purchased something on a credit card with money I didn't have. How about this? I've purchased something I didn't need because it made me feel better in the moment. Or this, I have felt self-conscious over the affluence of my lifestyle. Or the last one, I've had moments where I wished I had been more generous than I was. Now, I want to make the confession part of this as gentle as possible. And so let me put it like this. How many of you answered true to at least one of these questions? Just slip up your hand, if you will. True to at least one of these questions. Or how many of you are sitting next to someone who should raise their hand because they look pretty greedy? No, don't do that. This is church. Come on, guys. You should know by now. Listen, here's what I think happens for a lot of us. We live in a world where we're bombarded with the message, you need more, you should make more, acquire more, earn more, want more. And so we start to believe it and we activate what I've heard called the more cycle. And the more cycle begins with this one sneaky lie. If I had a little bit more, then I would be happy. The problem is there's something about the nature of stuff that assures that we will never get enough of it. Have you ever had this experience? Like there's a new thing that you really want and you long for it and maybe you even lust for it. Maybe it's like a new car or a new outfit or a new device and you can't wait to buy that thing. And when you finally get that thing, at first it's amazing. But once you own it for a few weeks or maybe a few months, suddenly you find yourself just not into it anymore. Like the shine has worn off and you're back into the more cycle looking for that next thing that's going to temporarily make you happy. And so it's back to Amazon and it's back to the store and it's back to Facebook Marketplace for the next thing to fill that void. And after a few trips around this cycle, we're asking, why don't I feel peace? Why am I so discontent? Why aren't I happier? And to top it all off, why do I always worry about money still? Well, it's because the more cycle adds complexity and not contentment to our lives. And if we don't get a handle on it, it's going to lead to a dark and shriveling soul. You see, the more cycle can be summed up with one word: greed. Greed is a matter of the heart, and I know it's important because it was important to Jesus. You know, over 20% of Jesus' teachings recorded in the Bible are about money. He knew that maybe more than anything else, money and the more cycle can hijack our hearts. Our money is a spiritual issue. In fact, it's impossible to be a maturing disciple of Jesus and to be upside down financially because of greed. So as we've said, each of these toxic emotions comes with a debt. Guilt said, remember debt said, I owe you. And anger says, you owe me. Here's what greed says. Greed says, I owe me. Greedy people believe they deserve any and every good thing that might come their way. Their mantra is, what's mine is mine because I earned it. And there's a lot more where that came from. And consequently, it's hard to get a greedy person to part with their money or stuff. Why? Because it's theirs, and they're hanging on to it. And by the way, there are poor, greedy people, and there are rich, greedy people. It is not a socioeconomic issue because, as we said, greed isn't a financial issue. It's a heart issue. And more money doesn't make greedy people less greedy. In fact, they never feel like they have quite enough. And so they're rarely at peace with themselves, and they're not at peace with others, and they're certainly not at peace with God. And so what do we do with all this? Well, I want to take you to a little passage in Luke 12 where Jesus talks about this very issue. There's a famous parable, but we're not even going to major on that. We're going to look at either side of it. But here's today's big idea. It's that cultivating generosity counteracts the craftiness of chronic greed. If you have your Bible or your Bible app ready, you can find your way to Luke chapter 12. Jesus has been painting a picture of what it looks like to really follow him as a disciple. This idea of discipleship has also become our all-consuming focus here at Grace. What does it look like for us to follow Jesus as we live out God's story every day, everywhere? To be a faithful apprentice to Jesus is our sole desire here at Grace. And so leading up to Luke 12, Jesus has been teaching about things like he's been saying, don't be surprised if people will want to kill you. Don't be surprised when you're led before the authorities for preaching my name. That's going to be part of the deal. Then there's a pause in the action, and some guy who's kind of pushed his way up to the front of the crowd blurts out what seems to be a kind of random request. Look at Luke 12, verse 13. He says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, these kinds of disputes were typically brought to ancient rabbis, and so they could act as kind of a mediator, giving guidance and advice. It wasn't legally binding, but kind of their version of a Judge Judy, okay? Look at verse 14. It says, Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" And it sounds like Jesus is being snarky, and maybe he is, but he's also doing what he often does, and that is to kind of sidestep the presenting question so that he can pinpoint the heart of the matter. And so it's like he's saying, interesting question, bro, but that's not really the core issue. The issue is greed. And look at verse 15. So he says, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And so, first of all, when the Savior of the world, when the God of the universe says, "Watch out," and when he says, "Be on your guard," our ears should probably perk up. We should probably pay attention to what's next. And so let's pause here and look at this phrase that he says next. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. He says all kinds of greed, which means there are different kinds. This implies that greed is a sneaky sin. It's one of the most deceptive. When we hear the word greed, we think of Scrooge. And there is a Scrooge kind of greed. When there's no compassion, there's just a heartless guy sitting around counting his money. It's easy to look at that picture and say, well, that's not me. I have compassion. My heart always goes out for people who have less. But Jesus says, yeah, but that's not the only kind of greed. There are all kinds. One of the things we've done to make greed less obvious in our society is we've figured out ways to express greed in virtuous terms. And so we say things like, well, I'm just careful. I'm a saver. I'd love to help, but I'm just looking out for my family first. Or I would never want to be dependent on someone else to take care of me. Or I'm a good steward. That's the Christian version. I'm just protective of my stuff. I make sure that it doesn't get dented or busted or broken, or I want to be generous, but I just don't have any extra right now to give. And so in our society that's fixated with money, by the way, and materialism, we've created some workarounds. And so greed often camouflages itself as a virtue. And it's therefore very dangerous. It's why Jesus says such strong language here. Watch out, be on your guard. He didn't say that about many other sins because they're not as uniquely sneaky as greed is. Because when greed gets lodged in your heart, it begins to affect everything. It becomes a filter by which you start to make all your decisions, financial decisions, relational decisions, future decisions. It creeps into your heart and it starts poisoning everything. And it's so sneaky, sometimes you don't even know you're doing it. Like most sins, you know when you're committing them. If you're lying, if you're stealing, cheating, gossiping, if you're committing adultery, like you're fully aware that you're committing those sins as they're happening. You don't just one day go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've been having an affair for the last 3 months. I had no idea. There's no confusion about adultery. But with greed, we can deceive ourselves. I have over 30 years in full-time ministry. And of all the various sins that people have come into my office to talk to me about, pride or lust or addictions or slander, I can't remember one single incident of somebody walking in my office and saying, you know what I need help with, Pastor? I need to work on my greed. Why is that? Well, greed is really hard to see in the mirror. And so Jesus says the Scrooge kind of greed isn't the only kind of greed out there. In fact, there are all kinds. But then he dials in. He gives us one very specific kind of greed to ponder. He says at the end of verse 15 that there is a certain kind of greed where you think that the purpose of your life, the value of your life, comes down to the acquisition of more stuff. He said there are people who think that their life, here's the phrase, consists in an abundance of possessions. Now, we all know in our heads that life is much more than that. But let me ask you a question. What does your actual life say? What does your personal spending history say? Does anyone live like your life equals new and shinier and better? I mean, how many pairs of shoes do we need? How many closets do we need? How many garages do we need? How many storage units? How many, kind of before we reach that abundance of possession status? And for me, it tends to be books. How many books do I really need? It's a kind of greed. And you and I can live our whole lives and be unaware of it. And that's the point of Jesus. See, after this poignant response that Jesus gives, he goes on to tell the parable of the rich fool. And I'm just going to summarize it very quickly for you. See, this is the story of a man who had committed his life to the strategy that said, winning in life means acquire and accumulate. He thought his life was about, what Jesus says, the abundance of his possessions. And boy, was business good. And so he kept stockpiling, and he kept building more barns, and he kept raking in more profits, and he thought all the extra that God was providing was for himself. He said, I'm a saver, I'm an investor, I'm looking out for my future, and his pile kept getting higher and higher, except one day, when he least expected it, there was this one little data point that he failed to account for, one line on his itemization sheet that he never took into account, and that line was his own mortality. He forgot that he was going to die and that there's a life beyond this life that we're experiencing right now on earth. Now, last time I checked, this is still true. The death rate for humans is still hovering right around 100%. I mean, that's a pretty obvious projection to miss. But he had put all his focus on accumulation, and then he died. And while the eulogies were being doled out at his funeral, and person after person got up to the podium and said that he was a pillar of the community and that he had created so many jobs and he was a picture of success, God kind of stood in the back of the room with his arms folded, and he gave a pretty harsh one-word assessment of this man's life. He said, fool. And he wasn't being rude. He was just being honest. He was a fool. This guy lived his whole life as if every dollar that he earned was meant for him. And God stands amazed at the folly of any human being, no matter how smart, who prepares for every contingency, who covers every base and every eventuality, no matter how unlikely, and then forgets the one inevitable certainty that stares all of us in the face, which is, I'm going to die one day. And how might my heart be affected by this path that I'm currently walking on? See, the question Jesus wants us to confront is this in this parable. What if your financial income is not meant to increase your lifestyle, but to increase your generosity? You see, generosity is one of the ways that we can break the more cycle that poisons our hearts. And not only that, it expands our hearts towards the way of Christ. As our big idea says, cultivating generosity counteracts the craftiness of chronic greed. Now, I want to go back to the text. Jesus concludes the section down in verse 32. And so to recap, in his teachings on discipleship, Jesus talks about the craftiness of all kinds of greed. And then he tells the parable of the rich fool. And then he concludes with these words. He says in verse 32, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." So he's subtly pointing out here that fear is at the root of all greed. So he says, fear not, kids. Your dad has a really big kingdom to give. So what? So sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now, let me be clear from the full counsel of Scripture. Jesus is not saying don't have a savings account. He's not saying don't have an emergency fund or 401k or college fund for your kids. The Bible teaches that wise and prudent people prepare responsibly for their financial future. And in Proverbs, Solomon tells us to be like ants that store up food so that they can get through the winter. So God expects us to prepare responsibly, just not greedily. And so Jesus gives the solution to our greed. Now, the solution isn't hard to understand. It's just hard to do. It would be great if I could stand up here and just give you a prayer and say some magic words and God would exorcise our demons of greed. But instead, what God says is, here's what you do. Instead of investing all your extra in your own kingdom, invest the first and best part of your extra in my kingdom. It's called generosity. And that's God's antidote for greed. It's like going to the doctor and the doctor saying, do you want to get your heart better? Well, there's no magic pill I can give you, but it's going to take some effort. It's going to take some commitment. You're going to have to stop doing some things. You're going to have to start doing some other things that you're not doing. But there is hope for your heart that if you'll follow my prescription, you'll get better. And that's what Jesus is doing here. And as disciples of Jesus, you and I need to have a well-defined strategy for generosity. One that you build into your life, that you can fall back on when times are tough, that's going to guarantee that you're posturing your heart in a discipleship posture of generosity. Why? Because otherwise you won't do it. And so I want to explore 4 practical ways to cultivate a heart of generosity. See, at first, generosity might feel like a chore, but it is ultimately the gateway to the most fulfilling life possible on this earth. I'm completely convinced of this. Do you realize that giving isn't just some obligation that God, the big killjoy in the sky, demands of us so that we won't have any fun? No. The generous life is a better life. You will like your life better if you are giving freely than if you don't. And bonus, cultivating generosity doesn't only help us to live a more fulfilled life now, it also allows us to lay up a glorious future in eternity. Jesus is saying that there is a way to lead your heart into generosity. It's by putting your treasures in the right place. And so how do we do that? How do we prioritize putting our treasure into God's kingdom first? Here's 4 ways. 1, develop a strategic awareness of needs around you. I've discovered that what tends to drive my greedy tendencies for more stuff for me boils down to one word: awareness. What do I mean? Well, I've never wanted one single thing that I didn't know existed. But there have been many things that as soon as I found out that they existed, suddenly I wanted them. And soon my brain goes into overdrive, convincing myself that I don't just want that thing, I need that thing. I hear about that new iPhone release or that new Tesla or that new vinyl record or whatever it may be for you, and my mind goes into overdrive, figuring out all of the reasons why I need that thing. But as Kim and I have become more systematically aware of the needs in our world, in our community, in our church, and as we've been involved in Serve Erie, for example, as we've come face to face with some of the needs of our community by building in a discipline of paying attention to what's going on in the community, paying attention to the local news and issues of our times. Or as we've had dinner with the Luskys, for example, who came face to face with the needs of Japan. Or as we've had vision initiatives here at Grace and become aware of how collectively we could change things in our region as a church. It's helped me to rein in my quest for stuff. That same awareness muscle that normally drives the desire for more stuff is activated in a different way and now fuels a desire to be generous. I'll never forget early in our marriage, Grace Church was entering into a season of raising funds for some strategic church initiatives. And Kim and I prayed, and we put our heads together and we put our hearts together, and we decided to give the equivalent of 1 year of my salary to this 3-year initiative. I mean, it was a huge step for us at the time. But man, the thrill ride of the generosity adventure that we went on together as a couple, and it started to ignite our hearts for giving to the kingdom in a whole new way. And so one way to cultivate a heart of generosity is to turn down the dials of awareness on all the stuff you want to purchase and turn up the dials of your strategic awareness of needs in the world. And do this by serving in the church, on a ministry team. Do this by getting involved in the community through Serve Erie or another organization. Do this by paying attention to the local news. Increase your awareness. The second practical way to cultivate a heart of generosity is to liquidate some stuff and give it away. In our passage, Jesus says in verse 33, he says, sell your possessions and give to the needy. He said the goal is to be rich toward God. And so one way to do that is to give what you don't need and to give it to those who are in need. So imagine the heart transformation that would happen if when you got extra of anything, that your first instinct was to have a conversation with God about what you're going to do with that. See, usually when we get extra, we assume it's for us and we just spend it. And that provides a little window into our hearts. Oh, more? That more must be for me. Maybe it's not. Now, there's no formula for how much do we give away. To the rich ruler, for example, Jesus said, sell everything you have and give to the poor. Sell all of your possessions. When Zacchaeus met Jesus, he says, look, Lord, I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anyone of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times the amount. So Zacchaeus gave like 50% of his stuff when he met Jesus. In Acts 4, we find out that Barnabas sold a field that he owned, and he brought the money and he put it at the apostles' feet. We know that he was a wealthy man. We don't know how many other fields he owned, but he liquidated at least one field, and he sold it and he gave his money to the church. So if our stuff is a tool, we should figure out what can't be used for kingdom purposes and sell it so that we can get some stuff that can be used for God's kingdom. I heard a story one time of a couple who chose to sell a valuable collection of stuff that was hanging on a wall in their basement. And they said, that'll never be used in its current form for kingdom purposes. So they sold it, and they bought a van that they used for many years to bring people to church with them. Or maybe just sell some of the stuff, some of your unused treasures, and just give that money directly to those in need or to shelters or food banks in our community who provide for them. There is joy when we see our temporary stuff through the eyes of how it could be used for kingdom purposes. The third practical way to cultivate generosity is don't accumulate more without applying kingdom filters. Now, this comes into play when we're looking at new purchases. Most people don't even reflect on their purchases when it comes to their faith. It's just like, oh, I'll buy this thing and it'll give me pleasure. What if we were a bit more intentional than that? What if we thought through a little checklist before you purchase something? So ask some simple questions like, have I prayed about it? And can I pay cash for it? Like, don't buy stuff you don't have the money to buy. Or what is my motivation for wanting this thing? Or how about, what are the long-term costs? See, it's not just the initial cost of the thing, but that motorcycle will require maintenance and gas, and that dog is going to require food and vitamins and probably loads of vet visits to keep it alive. And then just, will this purchase benefit God's kingdom or my kingdom? And again, the Bible doesn't tell us how many possessions are acceptable. We know that history is filled with very wealthy Christians and very poor Christians and everything in between. But the Bible is also very clear on this, that all our stuff is God's stuff. And all our stuff should be leveraged for eternity. And all our stuff has an impact on our hearts. Now, finally, in the last verse we looked at, Jesus takes us to this powerful principle that can really untangle your heart from all kinds of greed. He says, here's the principle. Tell your money where to go, and your heart will follow it there. When you make a decision to send your treasures to God's kingdom, guess where your heart is going to follow? It's going to follow to God's kingdom. And if you send your money into the stock market, guess where your heart's going to go? The stock market. If you send your money into fantasy football leagues, guess where your heart goes? Like, these things aren't bad in themselves, but Jesus points to this. He says, you can use your treasures to lead your heart. It happens anyway. Jesus is saying, I'm not after your treasures. I have a heaven filled with treasures that will blow your mind. I don't need your money, but what I'm after is your heart. And so he says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so if you want a barometer to measure the state of your heart, don't just start with your prayer life. Don't start with, if you sing all the words to the worship songs, or if you made it to church 3 out of 4 Sundays, even if you're serving the poor every Thursday. Jesus says, if you want to find out where your heart is, follow the money trail. Show me your credit card statement and I'll be able to diagnose the condition of your heart. That's why this next practice is so absolutely critical. That the most logical way to be generous is to tell your money where to go first. And I would phrase it this way: become a percentage giver. At a basic level, this simply means making a decision that I'm going to give a certain percentage of my income to things that are outside my kingdom. Now, I want to talk about this generally for a moment and then get to a couple burning questions, because this was God's idea a long time ago. What the decision to give a percentage of my income away does is that it allows me to be intentionally generous and to not leave it in the hands of my feelings or emotions, which can be very unpredictable and untrustworthy. So generosity starts with a decision, just like every other important thing. I'm up front choosing my priorities. I'm being systematic by building structure into my life so that I can assure that what is important to me happens, instead of just kind of waiting for the mood to strike. And so let me give you a couple examples. Take two friends. Both of them say, we want to exercise. We believe in exercise. And one does it when she remembers and when she has time and when she feels like it. The other builds it into a regular scheduled time. Whether she feels like it or not, she's doing it. Which of them, in the end, is in better shape? It's the one who put a system in place. Or take two guys and a dentist. Sounds like the start of a bad joke. One of them, every time he goes to the dentist, he schedules his next trip. The other guy waits until he is in the mood to see the dentist. Are you ever in the mood to see the dentist? Which guy keeps his teeth in the end? It's the guy who builds it into his schedule, and you get the point. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says, each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. See, there's an intentionality to giving. There's a deciding ahead of time, what you've decided in your heart. And when we do that, he says, it allows us to give cheerfully because we're assuring that our priorities are right. It helps you to give from the top, not the bottom. It helps you to give your best to God first, rather than whatever's left over at the end of the week or the month. The questions that always come up when we talk about percentage giving are things like, how much are we talking? And where should I give it? And so in the Old Testament, God set a practice in place that would systematically remind people that all they have is his. And a portion of that should go back to him right away at the very beginning. In the Old Testament, God gave Israel the practice of tithing, giving 10% of one's income to God. Now, if you go back and add up all the tithes, it was actually north of about 30%. But this word tithe actually means tenth. But in the New Testament, the tithe isn't directly commanded. And so people often think, well, this is not something we need to worry about or talk about anymore. Here's the problem with that argument. When Jesus came, he never lowered the bar on the Old Testament. He always raised the bar on everything. And so the New Testament teaching is not that 10% of your stuff is God. Jesus said 100% of your stuff is God. It's all on loan to you, and it's all his. And so Kim and I, for example, have always looked at 10% like a beginning amount. And here at Grace, we're not always banging the drum for a tithe, but we still encourage the tithe as almost a kind of training wheels to get you on the road to true generosity. Now, there's some of you who aren't giving 10% of your income, and in fact, it may be more like 3% or even 1%. But there's some of you doing that you're just one decision away from going on an absolute adventure with God. I know tons of stories of people who just kind of went cold turkey into giving 10% of their income away, and it was no turning back. And it is a soul-expanding, heart-pounding adventure of generosity that I believe we're all supposed to be on. There are also some of you that for a variety of reasons could not just start giving 10% today because your life is not set up currently to make that happen. And for you, I want to challenge you this way. I want to challenge you to choose a percentage that you want to get to based on where you are now. And give yourself a 3 to 6 month time frame and do it. And if you're in a rut or a crisis or you're loaded up with debt, just get some help. You can take any number of debt reduction courses online or FPU, but do something to get yourself in the generosity game. And frankly, there are others of you who 10% isn't even scratching the surface. And here's the question that I would challenge you to ask yourself. Is giving at my current percentage expanding my heart toward generosity? And if the answer is no, if you're just doing it and not thinking about it, it's probably time to move that up, to take your heart for a little joyride. Some of you need to go on the reverse tithe adventure and ask yourself, what if we made a plan not to give 10%, but to live on 10% and give the other 90% away in generosity? I'll tell you this, your heart will be more spiritually healthy than it's ever been in your whole life. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will follow. Now, the second question that I always get when we talk about this is this: where should you give? And listen, there are many wonderful organizations and causes that you could give to. But I can't just get away from this idea that in the Bible that the Christian should designate the majority of their giving to their community of faith, to their local church first. To say it plainly, I would expect believers who call Grace their church home and who attend here and who are spiritually fed here and who disciple their kids here and who are involved in the mission here to not have the majority of their giving going to other organizations. The local church is how God has arranged for the redemption of the planet until he comes back. And we can just do more together, especially in a church like ours. And so let me just challenge you with another thing about generosity. And this is something that I hear a lot. Don't wait to be generous. So many people think, I'm going to give once I have more, I'll give when I get a little bit older. It's just been proven again and again that this rarely happens. That once even a hint of greed enters in, it just stays there. No matter how high your standard of living goes up, your standard of giving kind of stays the same. And so if you're ever going to be generous, it should start right now. During your lifetime, mine, the average person is going to handle over $2 million. For many of you, it'll be much more than that. But each of you is going to manage a small fortune. And if we're all going to give an account one day of our lives before God, won't our finances be part of that conversation? Won't we have to answer questions like where did it all go? What did I spend it on? What has been accomplished for eternity through the use of all of that wealth that I managed for all of those years? I know we live in a culture that's so crazy around money. There are far more people trusting in money than are trusting in God these days. And this greed is really destructive in a community, and it's really destructive in a soul. Guys, greed destroys us. It steals our joy. It shrivels our heart. Greed destroys people around us, and greed destroys our life with God. We cannot serve both God and money. And if we value our money, if we value our stuff more than we value our obedience to God, it will begin to drive a wedge between us and God, guaranteed. The early church was made up of people who didn't have much money, but they stunned the world with their generosity. And most of us, we have a lot of money. And so what if we took the world's breath away one more time? As a next step today, I would encourage you just to go back through these four points, choose one of the 4 ways to cultivate a heart of generosity, and just commit to practicing one of them this week. Find a starting place and take a step. I love you guys.